Hello, this is Dr. Richard Olivas, and this is History 11. Our lecture today is called Colonizing a Continent. And the main idea we hope to convey is listed on your screen as our thesis statement. In the 17th century, European immigrants from varied backgrounds and motives created a social, religious, and political laboratory in North America as they sought a better life. Their colonies mixed commerce and religious utopianism. So it's important to always understand how a company or a country starts. And so when we look at the early years and how our country started, it gives us a better idea into how it came to be what it is now. The first English colony in North America was planted off the Carolina coast in the 1580s. It was called Roanoke. It was small, it was very poorly financed. This is a picture of Roanoke, sometimes called the Lost Colony because it failed. And people don't really know what happened. Perhaps the people that were there were killed in a tsunami-like event. Perhaps they starved to death. Perhaps there were Indian attacks. We don't know. What we do know is that it failed. And that failure left a bad taste in the mouth of the English king, who was determined after this to never fail again. Even though it failed, it also importantly represents the first English challenge to Spanish dominance of the Western Hemisphere. And it also marks the beginning of English conflict with Native Americans or Indians. The first colony to succeed, although it nearly failed in the early years, was Jamestown in 1607. This is a drawing of Jamestown. This was the first permanent English colony since Roanoke failed. The merchants who financed this colony got a charter allowing them to set up a joint stock company called the Virginia Company of London. A company, stockholders and colonists who came hoped to make a profit by mining minerals they thought to be here, trading for furs and skins, and discovering a passageway thought to exist through North America to China. Instead, the early settlers died of starvation and disease. What made Virginia a success was the discovery of saltweed or tobacco. Now, in early Virginia, the death rates were very high, sometimes called mortality rates. More than 9,000 colonists that we know of came to Virginia between 1610 and 1622. But the colony still remained small due to the high death rate. What saved Virginia economically was not only the cultivation of tobacco, but the offer of free land to those who would come. Now, tobacco is what we call a staple crop. It is grown largely for export because you can only chew so much or smoke so much. The rest was intended to be exported out of Virginia and out of Jamestown and Virginia into Europe and the Netherlands and England and places inside Europe where young males were becoming addicted to smoking. Tobacco required nearly constant attention. Indentured servants and later enslaved Africans planted, harvested, and prepared crops for shipment. These engravings, this one you see here, and some that will follow, show the laborious process of tobacco cultivation, including drying the leaves in an open building, pressing them into a barrel called a hogshead, and then storing the hogshead. And then after the crop was inspected, the hogsheads were taken by boat or rolled overland for loading onto a tobacco ship. This is an actual photograph, a photograph of an actual barrel or hogshead. For shipment, dried tobacco leaves were packed in a large wooden barrel called a hogshead. They're sealed by skilled coopers to make them airtight and watertight. And then they have those pieces of wood around them to roll them. They're like tires, sort of, but they're made out of wood. In 1775, Virginia and Maryland exported more than 100 million pounds of tobacco, worth about $4 million at that time. And tobacco made up 75% of the total value of all exports from those two colonies. How much tobacco could you fit in a hogshead if you knew what you were doing? Plantation workers packed tobacco for shipment to England. They piled dry tobacco leaves inside a hogshead and pressed them down with weights or like a screw and a lever, and repeated the process until the hogshead was full and then tightly packed. This is called the old method of getting tobacco to market. After the crop was inspected, the hogshead were taken by boat or rolled overland to load onto a tobacco ship. As you can see here, they're almost to the water. It appears to be close to the water. Here you see tobacco on the boats making their way to market, actually making their way to a larger ship waiting close by. Now, if you have a labor-intensive year-round crop like tobacco, you've got to have a lot of workers. So the question is, where did Virginia get the workers? The original plan after the Columbus voyages was to enslave Indians, but as we know, in the Great Dying, too many of them perished, probably 2/3, and many who survived were weakened. And so they fled inland or westward. So Indians were not a reliable labor supply. What Virginia decided to do was to bring English men, mostly men, but some women, to bring English men and women to Virginia to work and to adopt a system called indentured servitude. An indenture is a contract. So it's contract labor. This is an actual copy of one of those contracts, or its indentures. Tobacco needed intensive care and thus required a reliable supply of cheap labor. Cheap labor was provided by European immigrants who sold their labor for a period of years in return for passage on a ship to America. Those who signed an indenture or contract like this voluntarily became indentured servants, not slaves. At the end of their term of service, usually 7 years, the servant received, as you can see in the circle there, 50 acres of land from the governor of Virginia or Maryland, and the master for whom the servant worked also received 50 acres of land. That land grant system of 50 acres to the servant and 50 acres to the master is called the headright system. Now, as you can imagine, a large number of English immigrants coming to Virginia would use up a lot of land, and the headright system used land quickly. And so it did not take long for tension to break out between the colonists and Indians. In 1622, Indians attacked with a ferocity called the Powhatan War. That attack bankrupted the Virginia Company of London, which lost its charter. And the King of England assumed direct control of Virginia from this point on, making Virginia a royal colony. And a ruthless New Indian policy was adopted. The now numerous and resolute colonists, with the help of English soldiers, developed a plan to bring the Indians into subjection, which, as this document points out, included continually harrowing and burning all their towns in winter and spoiling their wares. You can see here the manner how to bring the Indians into subjection. December 15th, 1622, from the records of the Virginia Company. First, by keeping them from setting corn at home and fishing. Then, having 200 soldiers on foot, continually harrowing and burning all their towns in winter. The reason to do it in winter is because everyone's gathered in their towns and doesn't hunt, but everyone sort of hunkers down for the winter. And that's when the attacks were carried out and the burnings. Virginia was determined to do everything it could to save the colony and to save tobacco. Next door, Maryland was founded. Maryland, on this map, you can see has the red outlines. Virginia's sort of on the lower left, Maryland's in the upper right. They touch each other. Virginia's down here, Maryland's up here, and they touch like that. Maryland was founded as a refuge for English Catholics in North America. Marylanders quickly took up free land, imported indentured servants, established institutions of representative self-government, and began to grow tobacco on plantations along rivers. Maryland became like a little Virginia, and they may have had different religions, or different versions of Christianity, but what they held in common was greater than that. What they held in common was faith in tobacco. What was it like to live on the Chesapeake? Chesapeake meaning Virginia and Maryland. It was uncertain in a way, because if you get 50 acres of land after 7 years, then you want to add to that land, particularly if you're going to have children and you're going to give them land. And so you've got to work 7 years to get the first 50 acres, and then you've got to work another 7 years to get another 50 acres, and then another 7 years to get 50 acres. And it could take you 5-7 year periods, 35 years easily, to get enough land to support a family and pass it on to your children. So life was uncertain. People were always postponing things. You could not even get married under indentured servitude until you had completed your indenture. So people postponed even marriage. And of course, in the beginning, there were substantially more male indentured servants than there were female. So it was hard to find a marriageable partner. The uncertainty of life and the instability of the tobacco economy were reflected in the crude, sort of cramped homes built by the colonists. Even prosperous planters did not construct the more substantial homes or plantation manners that some of us are used to seeing in pictures and stuff until the 18th century. This is called the Old Stone House in Richmond, Virginia. It's not, we don't know the exact date, but the style that it represents, according to experts on Virginia architecture, is very typical of dwellings in the 1670s, 80s, and 90s. In the first century of Virginia settlement, this was considered a very large home, but the plantation manners, of course, come later. So Virginia and Maryland spread out and on 50-acre plots all along rivers and eventually take over that land. Now we shift our focus to Massachusetts and its progeny, meaning the colonies that arose nearby. Just like Maryland arose sort of out of Virginia, other colonies arose out of Massachusetts. Now, Massachusetts is what we call a utopia, meaning that people who came to Virginia wanted to make money, but others came to America to build, they said, a model society that, in their opinion, would glorify God. And we focus on the Puritans. And Puritanism, in particular, profoundly affected American development, at least in the way that we think, by planting the seeds of belief that our country has a special purpose. But of course, the Puritans' plan to banish diversity did not succeed. Now, the Puritans were very well educated. Many of them were wealthy. Many of them were high-ranking members of society. And in England, they believed that the Roman Catholic Church was corrupt. Now, this is a painting of King Henry VIII and his second wife, Anne Boleyn. Now, Henry VIII wanted to divorce his first wife, but the Catholic Church would not let him do that. So Henry VIII started his own church and made himself the head of it. And it was called the Church of England, or the Anglican Church. And then he made Anglicanism a Protestant religion, the state religion, the official religion of England. Now, the Puritans did not like Catholicism either, but the Puritans believed that the Church of England had a lot of corruptions in it. In other words, Henry VIII got rid of the Catholic Church and started a Protestant church, which is Christian but not Catholic. But the Puritans believed that the Church of England was still too Catholic. They didn't believe in the Pope, but they had a lot of religious ceremonies or religious costumes or clerical garb that looked Catholic. So Puritans wanted to purify the Church of England, and they wanted to reform the church and society as well. Harassed by the King of England for challenging the impurities of the state religion, Puritans decided to complete the Protestant Reformation and then establish a purified fragment of English society in North America. So they came. Now, we mentioned briefly the Pilgrims. They're different than the Puritans. The Pilgrims were separatists. They didn't try to convert the world, and they did not try to convert the Church of England. Instead, they separated from it. And led by William Bradford in this sort of idyllic picture, they established a colony based on farming and fishing until they became part of Massachusetts in 1691. The Puritans, on the other hand, were utopian. They had a very strong sense of purpose. The first governor of Puritan Massachusetts was this man, John Winthrop. And he said that Massachusetts would be a city on a hill, borrowing a metaphor from the Christian New Testament. And he wrote these words: "For we must consider that we shall be as a city on a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us, so that if we deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword throughout the world." Puritans believed that they would complete the Protestant Reformation that had begun in Europe, that they would complete it in Boston. And they believed that their purified society would be an example for Protestants in Europe to copy or emulate. But it's hard to build a perfect society and a perfect church and a perfect world. Utopias are very elusive. Just when it seems like it's within your grasp, then it slips away. The Puritans had a number of very important social accomplishments and economic accomplishments. They didn't rely on tobacco or something like that. They had a mixed economy. They set up the first printing press in America. They established a tax-supported school system eventually, and even founded a college to train ministers that ultimately became Harvard University. This is a drawing of the Boston Public Latin School, established in 1635. Believe it or not, that school still exists in Boston. It's not in that same location, it's a little bit bigger now, but it's still there. Now, if you have any society based on a Bible or a holy book, a Bible society, a Bible commonwealth, as the Puritans called themselves, you're going to have conflicts. You're going to have conflicts from within the society, and you're going to have conflicts that come from outside. One of those conflicts is, do you obey all the commandments in the Bible or just some of them? Now, Massachusetts set up a code of laws, and that code of laws was based on the Bible. That is, the crimes, the definition of the crimes came from the Bible, and then the punishment for disobeying those crimes came from the Bible. Now, this is a page from the laws of Massachusetts, printed in 1648. That's why some of the spelling is a little bit antiquated. These are capital laws. That is, for these crimes, people are put to death. Notice number 1, that's idolatry. Number 2, which I've put in red there, is witchcraft. 3 is blasphemy. People are put to death for blasphemy. Murder, anger, poisoning. Number 9, adultery. That's punishable by death. Number 10 is interesting, called man-stealing or kidnapping. Now, if the Puritans had enforced that particular crime, then there would have been no slavery in Massachusetts, because slavery starts with kidnapping. But the point is, all the laws in Massachusetts in the early years were based on the Bible, the definition of the crimes and the punishment of the crimes. And when someone was, in many cases, for instance, if you were charged with blasphemy, you were put on trial by the church or a church tribunal. And then whatever the church's verdict was, if it was guilty, then the state imposed the punishment that the church trial imposed or found. So here you have the church and state working together like that. Many people believe God gave the 10 Commandments on 2 tables or tablets of stone. Crimes of the first table, independent of some scholars, are crimes mostly against God. Crimes of the second table are crimes against your neighbor. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, and so on. The Puritan legal code in Massachusetts put people to death for committing religious crimes like idolatry and blasphemy, crimes of the first table. Now, Roger Williams, who was a Puritan minister from the town of Salem, where the witch trials took place later, said it was wrong to punish people for crimes of the first table. So he said some of the laws should not be enforced or created. Williams threatened the ideal the Puritan ideal of religious community by calling for the separation of church and state. He said people should not be punished for religious crimes. Forced to flee Massachusetts, Williams and his followers went south and founded the colony of Rhode Island. There, he founded the first Baptist church in America, was instrumental in it, I should say, and there Rhode Island practiced the separation of church and state. The separation of church and state, according to Roger Williams, means that the state may not punish religious crimes. In societies that practice the separation of church and state, the state cannot punish people for religious crimes like blasphemy, idolatry, witchcraft, missing church on Sundays, and so on. Now, this is a page from the legal code of Rhode Island. Now, you can see here is rape is listed. Now, Rhode Island, from the very beginning, practiced the separation of church and state, and it never punished religious crimes. You can see here for rape that it's death penalty. This is the penalty we do declare to be the felony of death. But then notice I've put little rectangles around 13 EDW, 6 RICH, and 13 EDW. That means that the definition of the crime and the penalty of the crime are not from the Bible. They're from the time of King Edward or King Richard. Notice under adultery and fornication, now the Puritans punished people with death. But notice, according to a precedent, a common law precedent dating from King Henry's time, says the penalty, the wisdom of the state of English have or shall appoint touching these transgressions. That means you have to, Rhode Island follows what England follows. And England doesn't, England has separation of church and state in this respect. And for man stealing, it says 5 years imprisonment according to a precedent set during the time of William and Mary. So to summarize, Rhode Island laws are not based on Bible verses. Second, Rhode Island crimes are based on English law, not the Bible. Third, so-called crimes of the first table like blasphemy and idolatry are not against the law in Rhode Island. That doesn't mean Roger Williams believed in blasphemy. He probably would just think if you commit blasphemy, you should be asked to leave the church if you won't stop doing it. But there's separation of church and state there. Another problem in a society like a utopia based on the Bible or any religious book is who has the last word? What is the highest authority? Is it the Bible or the Holy Book, or is it a voice from God? Now, in this respect, we take a look at Anne Hutchinson. Anne Hutchinson was a woman, a Puritan woman from Boston. She was very capable. She was very learned. She was well respected, and she was a midwife who helped bring children into the world. So she had a very important social position. Now, she had some interesting theological views, some religious views. Now, we don't need to go into those really, but in detail, but Hutchinson in effect claimed that Puritan churches were no different than Catholic or Church of England congregations, despite their belief that they were. So she criticized Puritan churches and how they were set up and how they were run, particularly on the doctrine of salvation. She was put on trial for conviction. She was put on trial, and convicted of sedition and contempt in 1637. She and her followers were disarmed, then banished from Massachusetts. This is a partial transcript of her trial. Now, in the first paragraph, she talks about voices. And then one of the judges says, how do you know that was the Spirit of God speaking? Anne Hutchinson answered that question with a question. How do you know, she said, how did Abraham know that it was God who told him to offer his son, being a breach or a violation of the sixth commandment? And one of the magistrates said, Abraham knew by an immediate voice. He heard a voice. And she said, so to me, by an immediate revelation. And they, as it were, tore their robes and said, enough, blasphemy, away with her, because she claimed to hear God's voice audibly. Now, Anne Hutchinson deserves substantial credit for strongly and capably defending her point of view, and especially in front of a male-dominated church-state tribunal. From an historical point of view, however, it is difficult to evaluate parts of her testimony if they are based on her having heard the voice of God. So that's evidence from the past that's a little bit difficult to assess. But she's a commendable figure nonetheless. Just as Virginia was influential in giving rise to Maryland, so too Massachusetts gave rise to other colonies nearby. Massachusetts gave rise to colonies around it like Connecticut, New Haven, and Long Island, because those colonies shared the views of Massachusetts, whereas colonies like Rhode Island and New Hampshire did not. But even Rhode Island was religious, but it didn't practice it practiced the separation of church and state. And some historians have called Roger Williams a left-wing Puritan. We should point out the relationship that the Puritans had with Indians around them. Because you can see from this map that Boston's located in the upper right, but they are deep in the presence of Indians. They're surrounded by, they're in Indian country, of course. Now, the Massachusetts Charter said that the Puritans wanted to convert Indians. And in this respect, they're very much like the Spanish or the French. They want to make converts among Indians. And at first, conflict with the Indians was minimal because European diseases, of course, had decimated Indian tribes. Many Puritans thought it was vacant, when in fact, many Indians had fled into the interior. But there were some Indians who welcomed the Puritans, partly because they thought that they could benefit from trading with Puritans, and also because some Indians, like the Narragansett, for example, hoped to make alliances militarily with the Puritans to fend off their own enemies, because a lot of Indian tribes were at war with each other and had blood feuds and so on. We don't want to presume, we don't want to think that Indians were sort of all living peaceably with each other until the Europeans came and ruined everything. It wasn't that way. There were a lot of tribal animosities, a lot of tribal alliances, but a lot of tribal enmities and blood feuds of long standing. The Puritans said that Indians were savages, that they were wild, and they were barbaric. This is a diagram, a drawing, that shows the Puritan attack on the Pequot village at Mystic, Connecticut in 1637 during the Pequot War. The desire for new land combined with a Puritan sense of mission led to the bloody Pequot War in 1637. The Puritans argued before the war that the Pequot were savages, but Puritan fighters themselves acted in a very barbaric manner at Mystic Village. The blue arrow shows where the Puritans entered Mystic Village. You can see in the circle, the inner circle, you can see Puritans with muskets or rifles firing, and the rifles coming out of the fire coming out of the end of the rifle barrel. And then behind them are Indians with bows and arrows. Those are the Narragansett. So the Puritans and the Narragansett allied together against the Pequot. But when the Puritans went into Mystic Village, they tried to kill every single person, every man, woman, and child, well after they had already obtained a surrender. And even their own allies had to cry out for the killing to stop. So in the end, the Puritans exhibited a large amount of savagery themselves, and they took the remaining men, women, and children that they did not kill, and they traded them into the Caribbean in exchange for the first African slaves that came into Boston in 1637. Puritan victory assured English sovereignty over the tribes in southern New England. Missionary work among the remnants of these tribes after the Pequot War led to the establishment of what were called praying villages, where Indians could go to practice Puritanism and learn English ways. These were called Red Puritans. What was it like to live in a town like Boston or another Puritan village? First of all, Puritans lived in what are called compact villages. The sort of everything kind of goes in. In Virginia, everything spreads out because of tobacco, but in Massachusetts, everything comes in. Puritans lived in compact villages around what was called the village green, where the meeting house and the tavern or the hotel were located. They farmed the surrounding land and grazed livestock and cut wood on pasture and forest lands that they held in common. How did you get land if you were a Puritan? Because they didn't have a headright system there. To establish a town, Puritans signed a compact or an agreement signifying their unity of purpose, and then they obtained a land grant from the General Court or the legislature of Massachusetts colony. Town officials parceled out the land according to the size of a man's household and his usefulness to the church and town. It's necessary to point out, but not surprising, how important church membership was in the local government of a Puritan village. This is a picture, a photograph of the Old South Meeting House, or the Third Church of Boston, that was built in 1729. Puritans emphasized local authority. Until 1684, only male church members could vote. Those men in good standing, those voters elected selectmen, say like city council people, who allocated land, passed local taxes, and settled disputes. Voters met annually to select town officers and make major decisions for the town. Many citizens served in minor government positions, hence complaints about officialdom were minimal or fewer than they might otherwise have been, because people knew it was difficult to serve in the government, having done it themselves. No settlement anywhere could be properly studied without knowing about the role of women, and that's true in the Puritan settlements too. Puritan women played a major role in Puritan society as wives, mothers, housekeepers, provisioners, those who purchased everything, processors of raw materials. Puritan homes, unlike The Chesapeake homes rapidly became substantial dwellings. Puritans also stressed education as a means of furthering their religion and the central values of their lives. The Great Migration ends. The Great Migration refers to the great movement, the moving of nearly 25,000 Puritans from England to Massachusetts between 1630 and 1642. 25,000. But in 1642, the movement slowed down. That's largely because the English Civil War, which began in 1642, slowed down the Puritan migration to England. For a period of about 20 years, England had no king, no monarchy. King Charles I was beheaded, as you can see in this picture, this drawing, and England became a commonwealth or a republic. This 20-year period is known as the Commonwealth period. So English people today still remember that there was a time in their history when they had no king. While the monarchy was restored with Charles II as king, English people know that kingly or monarchical power can be abolished if need be. From the St. Lawrence to the Hudson. St. Lawrence refers to French America, and the Hudson refers to Dutch America. So we've looked at the English settlements, now we're going to look at the French settlements. New France began in what is today Eastern Canada, Quebec, Montreal, those towns along the St. Lawrence River. In the early 17th century, the French sent Samuel de Champlain to explore Eastern Canada. Champlain founded Quebec in 1608. New France was built on the fur trade. Thus, migration to the colony was not encouraged, since settlement would destroy the forest and limit the fur harvest. This is a map of New France in what is today Eastern Canada. You can see there's Quebec, there's Montreal. Those are beautiful, beautiful cosmopolitan cities even today. They're really a sight to behold. We'll come back to talk about the growth of New France a little bit later. Also, we need to talk about the Dutch settlement in what is today New York and Manhattan Island. So you have the Spanish, the English, the French, and the Dutch, all in North America, while the Portuguese are in South America. The Dutch planted a small colony called New Netherland at the mouth of the Hudson River in 1624. This colony gradually extended into the Connecticut and Delaware River valleys. This is a drawing of New Amsterdam. New Amsterdam is the city inside New Netherland. So New Netherland would be the whole colony. New Amsterdam would be the capital. This is a map that we looked at earlier, but now I've circled in yellow New Netherland. And you can see the yellow arrow points to what is called New Amsterdam, or would be New York City today. New Netherland covered much of present-day New York State, with New Amsterdam occupying the lower tip of the Hudson River. And you can see the Hudson River there goes from Staten Island past Manhattan all the way up into Albany. The town of New Amsterdam was inside the colony, of course. Here's another map of Manhattan Island and surrounding areas in 1670. In this case, north would be at the right of the map. You can see North River there, which is actually the Hudson now. By 1624, the Dutch, or the Dutch-speaking people from the Netherlands, sometimes just we don't call them the Netherlanders, we could just call them the Dutch. Now, by 1624, the Dutch were the foremost commercial power in Europe, with an extensive trading empire in the Far East. In this painting, Jacob Martensen, a wealthy merchant with the Dutch East India Company, stands with his wife and points to ships in the harbor of Batavia, which today would be Jakarta, Indonesia. And you can see as a slave holds an umbrella over their heads. The Belgian lion was how the Dutch people saw themselves. They saw themselves as powerful, like a lion. And this is a map that was made in 1650 by a Dutchman. And it shows the strong self-image possessed by the Dutch Empire in 1650. And the source of that great strength, of course, was overseas trade, like we just saw in Batavia. It's really, really an impressive image. But England was preparing to challenge the Dutch. And it did so in a series of wars between 1652 and 1675. This is a painting that shows English and Dutch ships battling in the Second Anglo-Dutch War in 1666. And if you look at that picture, you can see destroyed ships and people trying to save themselves from drowning in the lower part as they get onto boats. The English captured New Netherland in 1664 and then held it permanently after 1673, renaming it New York. So New Amsterdam became New York, or New Netherland became New York. This is a beautiful image showing New York City in 1873, 200 years to the day almost after it took over the Dutch colony. 200 years after its independence from Dutch rule. And there you can see the Brooklyn Bridge on the right and the original part of New Amsterdam in the lower part. In fact, if you were to go downtown to New York today, you can see a lot of the remnants of the original Dutch colony still there. Much of it's gone, of course, but a lot of it's still there. Now we switch to Carolina, proprietary Carolina, a restoration reward. So we went up to New York, and now we're going back down to Carolina. Now this is a map. You can see at the top of the map, there's Virginia, and then below it is Florida. So Carolina, which now is North Carolina and South Carolina, but in the beginning it was just Carolina. It occupies that space between Virginia and Florida. In 1663, King Charles II, newly restored to the throne, granted Carolina to 8 men who had supported him when he was in exile. His father, Charles I, had been killed in the English Civil War, and then he regarded himself as the rightful heir, but he was not allowed to take the throne until sometime later. The Carolina Grant gave broad economic and political powers to the proprietors. The Carolina Grant originally included what eventually became North and South Carolina. Now, Carolina was just south of Virginia. This map shows connections between Carolina and Barbados and the Leeward Islands in the Caribbean. Now, the proprietors of Carolina promised religious freedom to people who would come. They promised them free land, but they also tried to set up a very semi-medieval government. But the people who came to Carolina ignored the proprietors' plans and did as they pleased, guided largely by their previous experience in the slave society of Barbados. So we say, historians say, that Carolina is a colony of a colony, meaning that the people who came to Carolina came from Barbados. Now there are two arrows in this drawing. The lower arrow pointing up points to Barbados. The upper arrow pointing down points to the Leeward Islands, and then the lower circle is around the Leeward Islands. The upper circle, of course, is around Carolina. The map shows the relative close proximity of Carolina colony and the British West Indies. Early settlement in Carolina was strongly influenced by trade with Barbadians and other West Indian settlers, as well as immigration from the West Indies of both planters and slaves to this new North American colony. This is a map of Barbados, a British slave colony in the Caribbean. By the time Carolina was founded, sugar plantation slavery was already deeply entrenched in Barbados and other English colonies in the West Indies. The Carolina settlers ignored the proprietors' plans, as we said, guided largely by their experience in the brutal slave society of Barbados. That is why Carolina was called a colony of a colony, because the settlers who came to the colony of Carolina came from the colony of Barbados, not directly from England. So the early or charter culture of Carolina strongly resembled that of Barbados. The Indian debacle. While planters of the Carolina colony sought peace with the Indians through regulated trade, settlers from Barbados paid no attention to those regulations. And they went beyond a very lucrative, profitable trade in deer skins and soon established the capture and sale of Indians as the cornerstone or the foundation of Carolina commerce. That is, the Indian slave trade, which they created, led to a series of intertribal wars. Colonists who came to Carolina from Barbados chose a tribe, armed it, and then rewarded it handsomely for bringing in captives from other tribes. Colonists justified this so-called thinning of the natives as necessary to make room for white settlement. But of course, it plunged the colony into warfare. And the leaders of Barbados realized that warfare based on Indian slavery and the slave trade was not sustainable. Instead, the leaders of Carolina began to cultivate rice because Carolina, especially on the coastal plain, is below sea level. It's very swampy there. And of course, rice, when you grow rice, you plant it underwater. So it's perfect for rice growing. So planters in Carolina staked out claims along South Carolina rivers and experimented with crops like sugar, indigo, tropical fruits like pineapples, tobacco, rice. But rice became the staple crop of the Carolina economy. And rice cultivation required brutal labor. Thus, large numbers of slaves were imported into South Carolina. So whereas the Chesapeake or the Upper South, Virginia, Maryland have a history of free blacks under the headright system, Slavery was virtually all there was from the very beginning inside Carolina. This map shows the division of Carolina into north and southern parts. The pine barrens of North Carolina attracted small tobacco farmers who came down from Virginia looking for free land. So North Carolina developed a mixed economy based on livestock, tobacco, naval stores, and subsistence farming, whereas South Carolina became pretty much a rice colony with indigo. Now we switch again up north to the Quakers and the establishment of Pennsylvania, the Quakers' peaceable kingdom. The Puritans were utopians, and so too were the Quakers, but they could not be more different. The Quakers had emerged during the English Civil War as one of the many radical groups seeking a more just society and a more pure religion. But they were persecuted in England for their defiance of civil authority and their unusual or unorthodox ideas. And many migrated to America. The society they founded in Pennsylvania foreshadowed or showed us in advance the religious and ethnic pluralism of the future United States. So we have to ask ourselves, what is pluralism? Plural means more than one. When historians say that the Society of the Quakers, founded in Pennsylvania, practiced religious pluralism, we mean that more than one religion was allowed there, unlike early Massachusetts, where Quakers, for example, were not allowed to worship. The Quakers are also called the Society of Friends. Quakers saw the Anglican Church or the Church of England as corrupt. But unlike the Puritans who tried to purify it, they believed, the Quakers believed, that they could find the grace of God not through perfect churches, but through the inward light or the spark of redemption that existed in every person. Quakers believed, quite correctly, it seems, that God loves everyone the same, men and women, rich and poor, black and white, free and slave. So Quakers refused to observe customary marks of deference that were practiced in English society at that time, because they believed that God was blind to social distinctions. The Quakers regarded oaths as profane, and they rejected military action and service. That is, they were pacifists. They also insisted on the spiritual equality of the sexes, and as this drawing shows, they allowed women to participate in Quaker religious services. Committed to converting the rest of the world to their beliefs, Quakers were persecuted everywhere they went. This document shows what can happen when there is no religious pluralism. Puritan Massachusetts did not practice religious pluralism, and they prohibited Quakers from meeting there. In 1661, Quaker supporter Edward Burrough published this book to document how Puritans persecuted Quakers. 22 have been banished upon pain of death. 3 have been martyred. 3 have had their right ears cut. 1 has been burned in the hands with the letter H, or heretic. 31 persons have received 650 stripes. 1 was beat while his body was like a jellyfish. Several were beat with pitched ropes, and so on and so forth. That's what can happen. And the Quakers decided their society would not be like that. That was their early plan. This is William Penn, the future proprietor of Pennsylvania at the age of 22 in 1666. actually not that many years before he founded Pennsylvania. William Penn, as a young man, had served time in Ireland, and he saw something of the contempt that many English people felt for the Irish. And he was convinced at an early age of the importance of the idea that God loves everyone the same. This is called The Birth of Pennsylvania, 1680, 14 years after that painting was made, the one we just saw. William Penn, you can see the yellow arrow there points to Penn, holding paper, standing and facing King Charles II in the King's breakfast chamber at Whitehall. William Penn, an English aristocrat, emerged as an unlikely Quaker leader in the repressive 1670s. Penn intended Pennsylvania to be a haven for the persecuted of all religious and national backgrounds. His state, he said, would not claim authority over the consciences of its citizens, nor would it demand military service of them. Quakers quickly absorbed earlier settlers in Pennsylvania, acquired land, elected a representative government, and practiced pacifism. This is a map of the province of Pennsylvania. Quakers and Indians. William Penn laid the foundation for peaceful relations with Native Americans by purchasing land from local chiefs, not seizing it, promising a very strict regulation of trade with Indians, and banning the sale of alcohol to them. Relations between Quakers and Native Americans in the early years were good, but later immigrants, especially the Germans and Scots-Irish, were land hungry and disdainful of the Indians, and that led to a considerable amount of conflict. Building the peaceable kingdom. William Penn's dream of a society free of violence, free of religious intolerance and arbitrary authority was never completely realized. But Quaker families scattered across the countryside and established a thriving polyglot society. And by mid-century, 1750, Philadelphia was the largest city in the American colonies. You can see Philadelphia about that time. The limits of perfectionism. Perfect societies are never perfect. As Pennsylvania grew and matured, all was not harmonious, even among Quakers. Dissension arose in part because of weak leadership and the Quaker attitude toward authority. In the absence of the binding tie of persecution, Quakers began to squabble and argue with each other. Quaker industriousness and hard work and frugality led to material success that over time eroded social radicalism and religious evangelicalism. In fact, some Quakers even began to own slaves. But Quakers continued for several generations to maintain good relations with Native Americans. And Pennsylvanians, and Quakers in particular, were more accepting of other peoples and other beliefs than those in other colonies. Lastly, New Spain's northern frontier. Spain settled in Florida and in what is today New Mexico long before any English settled on the Atlantic seaboard. But as the English arrived, or by the time the English were arriving, these thinly settled Spanish settlements faced revolt and disarray from their Indian laborers. This is a map of New Mexico and part of Arizona and Colorado, Utah, so-called Four Corners. And we take a look here at Pope's revolt, or the Pueblo revolt. The extraction of forced labor by the Spanish and the ravaging effect of European diseases pushed the Pueblo people to the edge of revolt by the end of the 17th century. Then, when Franciscan priests tried to stamp out and crush the Pueblo religion entirely, the Indians rose up in revolt behind Popé, killing more than 20 Catholic missionaries, hurling some of their bodies off of cliffs in northern New Mexico. The Spanish retreated, but returned in 1684, ready to accommodate the Pueblo. This is a statue in the nation's capital of Popé, holy man, farmer, defender, leader of the Indian Pueblo. The sculptor of this marvelous marble statue is Cliff Fragua, and Fragua described his statue in these words: "In my rendition, Popé holds in his hands items that will determine the future existence of the Pueblo people. The knotted cord in his left hand was used to determine if the revolt would begin, when the revolt would begin. As to how many knots were used is debatable, but I feel that it must have taken many days to plan and notify most of the Pueblos. The bear fetish in his right hand symbolizes the center of the Pueblo world, the Pueblo religion. The pot behind him symbolizes the Pueblo culture, and the deerskin he wears is a humble symbol of his status as a provider. The necklace that he wears is a constant reminder of where life began, and his clothing consists of a loincloth and moccasin in Pueblo fashion. His hair is cut in Pueblo tradition and bound in a chongo. On his back are the scars that remain from the whipping he received for his participation and faith in the Pueblo ceremonies and religion." It's a peaceful painting of the Pueblo people in Laguna, New Mexico today. Well, in the late 19th century, I should say. The decline of Florida's missions. In the late 17th century, English settlers in South Carolina began to raid Spanish settlements in Florida in search of Indian slaves. The Spanish missionary frontier was nearly completely devastated by 1713. Only St. Augustine survived as a Spanish outpost in Florida. This map from the 18th century shows evidence that mission-adjacent settlements on the old Mission Road between St. Augustine and St. Mark's were abandoned. Now notice there are two circles. The circle in the lower right says St. Augustine, that's the port city, and then on the left is St. Mark's. And then there's a road there with the names of different saints. That's called the Mission Road. That's where the Indian missions were. The Catholic missions to Indians were located. But people from Carolina came down raiding them. And then in that rectangle, it says, most of the settlements formerly marked on this road are said to be abandoned. So the frontier is nearly gone. Only St. Augustine really remained. And this is a view of St. Augustine about 1750. The Spanish mission frontier was devastated during Queen Anne's War, which lasted about first 13 years or so of the 18th century. Only St. Augustine survived as a Spanish outpost in Florida. So while the English are getting stronger, the French are getting stronger, the Dutch are gone, and the Spanish are weakening, at least in Florida. So to conclude, colonizing a continent. In the 17th century, European immigrants from varied backgrounds and motives created a social, religious, and political laboratory in North America as they sought a better life. Their colonies mixed commerce and religious utopianism. So early American societies were very different, and there's a lot of diversity. And as we will see in future lectures, those early distinctions sometimes carry forward so that the 13 colonies become very, very different. And the 13 states were and are very, very different. So to understand the way that things are now, it's very important to go back and see how things were at the very beginning. That concludes this lecture. I hope it was informative and interesting and helpful. I want to encourage you to go back and replay portions of it that are not clear, especially as you review the material. And please feel free to email me if you have questions. And I appreciate your attention very much. Thank you.